let's have a quick chat about Newcastle, I think, because another surprise of the season, Seb Stafford-Bloor, is that Newcastle are going into the break, I believe, in 3rd place.
Yeah. Quite right, Joe Devine. I don't think anybody thought that Newcastle's progress would be what it is. I think
John's still confused now, even though it's happening. I'll ask him about that shortly.
Well,
but go on.
Yeah, I think that's because I think you could see coming out of summer an obvious defensive improvement just on the base of their recruitment. So Sven Botman was going to make them better. Kieran Trippier was fit. Nick Pope was a better goalkeeper than Martin Dubravka. Like, all of these things added up to suggest there's going to be a more stable base.
Yeah.
I think what nobody really saw coming was sort of the emergence of attacking players who had been at the club for a while to a different level. Nobody saw Miguel Almiron becoming the player.
The renaissance of Almirón.
Yeah, so one of the things that we talked about in our Newcastle Sensible Transfers video was the need to replace him. And I remember having a conversation with a couple of Newcastle fans on Twitter who said that, no, you need 2 players for that position because it's just not enough. You can't have, you can't just depend on a new forward like at the time they were rumoured to be pursuing Alexander Isak, and obviously they signed him. But Almiron wasn't a lost cause, but just someone who belonged to the bottom half of the Premier League table. And he's arguably the form attacking player in the Premier League at the moment, which is just an extraordinary development. And I don't think there's a proper justification or an explanation for why that's happened beyond just if you create stability behind players, particularly kind of an attacking midfield player, you're going to see a different side of their personality to what you might do under someone like Steve Bruce, who insists that you just play behind the ball all the time and then attack in kind of 80-yard bursts, which is going to show a very different side of a footballer, isn't it?
Sure.
So, but it's been really interesting. It's been one of the. I'm interested by what happens next, though.
Well, let me put this to you, because I talked about this with John the other night, and we said it's a surprise. Yeah. They could very legitimately finish in the top 4. I mean, they just beat Chelsea at the weekend, and I know Chelsea aren't all that at the moment.
Yeah.
But they could legitimately finish in the top 4. If they do, then speaking of Arsenal in January, before maybe now's the time to double down. The summer, presumably for Newcastle, who have lots of money to spend, if they have Champions League football, is there a scenario where they've potentially kind of unintentionally or accidentally got about a 4-year jump on progress that they needed to make? Because the number of players and the quality of players they could buy in the summer if they finished Champions League, it's very possible, isn't it?
100%, because it would represent a quantum leap in what's happened before. So not to keep referencing our own work, but we talked about stepping stone players, didn't we, back in January? Released a video about it, whereby you have this squad churn as a result of having to buy players to climb up the league in small increments, and then you need to jettison them as soon as you can afford or as soon as you have access to a better quality player. Newcastle at the moment, if the season was to finish today, they would have skipped that step, and they're now in a position where they can go straight for the top shelf in the store.
Cristiano Ronaldo,
Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
Joe Pedro was never one that Arsenal should sign.
Joe Pedro,
the Watford forward. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
He's really good.
I like it. I like it. John, you sort of said to me a couple of times over the last few weeks that, even though the underlying numbers look good, which as discussed are just numbers to you because you look at them before you look at the scores, and that Newcastle are legitimately 3rd, playing well, beat Chelsea at the weekend, there's a part of you that still doesn't really understand it.
Yeah, and
what part is that?
Again, maybe I'm
the stupid part.
Maybe I'm just on my Mikel Arteta trajectory with Eddie Howe. But I look at and that's not even true, because like Arsenal were legitimately sort of putting up underlying numbers that put them 8th for the first couple of seasons under Arteta, and this is Eddie Howe coming in and immediately making Newcastle better than they were the season before, and now even better than they were last season.
But you're not a believer yet.
I wouldn't say I'm not a believer. I just am somewhat perplexed as to what it is that they're doing so well. Not least when I look at the team that they have, because this is very much about just playing very solid football, very principled football, but without necessarily some of the high level players that you might expect a team in that position to be in. And so we've got Miguel Almirón, who, as we've said, is playing really well. He's pretty much to the tune of about 50% overperforming on his expected goals. So there is a little bit of overperformance from him there, which helps. But they've lost Alan Saint-Maximin, who you would think of as being, I think, a difference maker for this team, and they're still playing well. They've perhaps been a little bit luckier on results more recently. Everything's sort of gone their way, but they, as we've said, they're still putting up underlying numbers that suggest that they are worth the position that they're in. And so, yeah, what they play nice, intense, high pressing football. They play aggressive football and fairly direct attacking. That they have players like Chris Wood and they have players like Dan Burn. And
when they say when they weigh a body as it's dying, and then when it dies, it's just a little half a gram lighter, the weight of the soul. Perhaps your maths can't quantify for a good feeling.
Well, I think something about this is that it's not even that tactical with what Newcastle are doing. Like, how do you manage a team? Is it the tactics? That's a small part of it, obviously. I mean, it can be a large or small part depending on what the manager is. But what Eddie Howe has done very well is cultivate he's changed the culture at the club. He's changed the intensity and the competitiveness within that. He's got players playing better than they should be, what a good manager does. And when you have that really exciting time that Newcastle fans have with suddenly loads of money, they're a different club, they are a super club now, so that's very exciting. So that you must get this sort of feeling at the club in the ground as well, around the city, where you just know things are going to happen, so it's exciting. And it reminds me a little bit of what Leicester had in the year they won the league. And if you think, if Arsenal and Man City weren't so good this season, if they'd done what happened the season that Leicester won it, Newcastle could easily be top at the moment and keep going with it, because you don't know when that momentum's going to end. And also they don't have midweek football that changes their team around, so they can mostly keep the same core of players going every single week from week to week. That really helps. Arsenal have benefited from that this season as well, even though they've played the Thursday games, but they've rotated a little bit, and that'll make a big difference to them going forward.
I guess it's just a shame they're owned by the Public Investment Fund, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
I did just want to
in my opinion.
I did just want to clarify that, like, I'm not saying Newcastle are bad, but we've just spent 15 minutes talking about what makes Arsenal good, and a lot of that is this ability to be tactically flexible, to do all of these smart things in build-up and stuff, and I don't see any of that from Newcastle. Newcastle are just playing, like, they're playing solid football.
And the players will suit the different bits. Like Joe Linton is now playing as like the left forward because he's a pressing forward. Essentially, he'll be playing midfield, obviously, and very good at that. But then what you get from that, rather than Saint-Maximin, is that rather than having a very dribbly boy, you've got a guy who suits the function of the team even better. So it actually might make that work. And then you've got, like, Bruno Guimaraes is clearly an amazing player. He makes a huge difference in there. And because he, if he was in a team like Man City or even Man United or something, he wouldn't be the standout player of that entire team. Whereas they can sort of make him the absolute star of this Newcastle team, because that's what he is now. And then it just is a good unit. It's a good unit around.
I've been pretty impressed by, like, Botman's surprised me. Because I remember watching him in Liga after I'd heard the name and I'd seen him in sort of transfer gossip columns, and you saw, like, good distribution, good left foot, big guy, like, useful in both boxes for set pieces. I just wondered, like, the big knock on him was always lack of pace, and I just wondered what would happen when you put some of the kind of the more dynamic Premier League pieces around him, and he's been excellent. Like, he's had a couple of minor missteps, but generally speaking, like, he looks like he's been playing in the Premier League for 5 years. And I'm not trying to paint the Premier League as kind of an entirely unique division. It's just that France to the Premier League is tricky. It's not like going from La Liga or from the Bundesliga or Serie A. It is a little bit different. But he's been excellent. Also, I wonder, as this period of the season has gone on, and very, very clearly there's a lot of very tired players around there, and there's a kind of a poverty of ideas, poverty of creativity within, certainly amongst some of the bigger sides like Chelsea of the weekend, Tottenham. Some of these teams look absolutely bereft of ideas, and so their way of combating that is either through set piece expertise or shelling penalty boxes with crosses and long balls. And, like, Botman is not just someone that hoovers up long balls. He's not just a forehead, basically, is he? At the same time, like, if you have him in there, you have Dan Burn in your back line as well. You have a very, very tall goalkeeper in Nick Pope. I think, like, you're kind of equipped. You have to do a lot of other things really well, but you're kind of equipped to deal with maybe the last 6 weeks of the Premier League. And I think that their defence, particularly at White Hart Lane a couple of weeks ago when they won, they're really, really good.
There's a question in this then, because if obviously, as it relates to Arsenal, for example, or teams that are doing something which, again, not to suggest that Newcastle don't have tactics, that's not what we're saying, but we would normally talk at this point about how a team might be figured out. If Newcastle are just playing solidly and well, then is the expectation that they will continue to do that for the second half of the season? I mean, they're not going to be found out, right?
But the thing is, people know how they play. It's not like they're not getting found out. It's the same as Liverpool. It's about intensity, and when you know how to stop that, if you're just playing really well, you can get through it. And they've got that team spirit, and it's the confidence, and it gives you momentum.
Everyone's got a forehead.
If you have one giant forehead, if you have many foreheads, then
it's much easier.
Yeah, they've got an 11 head.
Yeah.
They're really efficient. Like they're taking, if you look at some of the goals over the past few weeks, they're taking what they're being given. So we talked about that Spurs game, 2 Tottenham mistakes in that they score goals from. Yeah. I would argue that the single goal that Willett scored over the weekend to beat Chelsea, that comes from a series of defensive mistakes as well. Yeah. Now you can portray that as good fortune, but actually it's a skill, isn't it? If you're playing. If you're not overwhelming sides, if you're not exerting so much pressure on a team in a kind of blowtorch way that makes them eventually crack, then you have to take things as you're given, as they're given to you.
That's right. They're like a sort of a royal pet. They gobble down the food when it's given to them.
They take their chances, and I think that's probably what you would say about Eddie Howe's Bournemouth at their very, very best. They weren't a front foot team. They were a counterpuncher, but they took what they were given. They had the ability to kind of flow into the gaps that an opponent had.
Well, speaking of gaps, I'm moving on.
Okay.
It's too long.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Daniel Taylor, Ollie Kay, Amy Lawrence and Rafa Honigstein. There are journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.